Good morning, students. Happy to be with you. It's Monday morning, and this week we're going to start looking at World War II. This is such an important lesson that I don't want to let some of the notes and things go by without some explanation. And so I am in the process of looking at your one-pagers, and this week, I'll have them done this week. And so today and tomorrow, I just really want you to listen to some of these notes. And then Thursday and Friday, we are going to do an activity that actually the notes might help some of you. You will all have different topics, but this could probably help you. But either way, it's very important information to pass along to you. So in the last chapter, what I really wanted you to know is that there were two main points to that chapter. One was there was a depression happening definitely in the Western world, definitely between Europe and the Americas. But there was also this rise of totalitarian regimes. There was also these people who kind of stepped into these roles when their countries were in crisis. And Hitler is one of them. Of course, Stalin is as well. And so when we're looking at World War II, you should think of World War II as kind of a continuation of World War I. Because of World War I and the way it ended, especially with the Treaty of Versailles, World War II is just a continuation 20 years later. If World War I hadn't have happened the way it did, and it didn't end the way it did, World War II would have never happened. But it was bound to begin given the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And what's worse is war is always atrocious. But the way World War II was shaped because of systematic death on Hitler's part, that's what makes World War II so different and unique from World War I, and just terrible, just devastatingly bad. And we can't forget that we cannot deny that the Holocaust happened. So here we go. World War II is going to begin with Hitler's kind of path to power. Now keep in mind, he has been gaining power legitimately in Germany for the past almost decade. Actually, definitely almost a decade. So everything that Hitler was doing, do realize that he was doing, no, he might have been, very manipulative in doing it, but he did it legally in the Reichstag, in this new German Republic. But now, as we're closing in on the end of the 1930s, Hitler is going to all out violate the Treaty of Versailles. And part of the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany could not have a large military. They had numbers of military that they could have, and they couldn't have an air force. And there you see those planes there. By the end of World War I, planes were becoming hugely important as a weapon of war. And part of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles is that Germany was not allowed to make a military air force. Well, he did. It's called the Luftwaffe. And the Luftwaffe becomes one of the most impressive air forces until the American Air Forces get involved. Now, people would argue that the Japanese Air Force is quite impressive too. Their Navy was really impressive, but the German Air Force is just as impressive as anybody else's. He mobilized German troops to the Rhineland area of Germany. This area was demilitarized. Remember the word militarization, the buildup of troops and supplies. Part of the Treaty of Versailles was that you could not do that, and especially to this area that bordered France and Belgium and the Netherlands, that whole area of the Rhineland. I want to look at this map real carefully. So do you see this area in black called the Saar? The Saar region was incredibly important because it was a very industrialized region. They had lots of iron ore reserves and they produced a lot of manufactured goods, especially heavy manufacturing like tanks and airplanes and things like that. So that area of Alsace-Lorraine, by the way, Alsace-Lorraine had been French controlled, and then you remember the Franco-Prussian War, they lost Alsace-Lorraine to the Germans, and then France got it back in World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. So this area of the Rhineland was to be this demilitarized zone. You can see that in kind of the checkered shaded area. The Ruhr Valley, these areas all have impressive waterways that were highly desirable. The Sudetenland, we'll talk about that in a little bit here. So these areas were off limits, and Hitler specifically sends troops to these areas, and he is not allowed to do that. He is all out violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. However, when he does this, European nations don't stop him. They don't enforce the treaty. I would imagine partly because they're scared of another war, and partly because maybe their own economy is in shambles and they're worried about, we can't even organize our own country economically. We're not going to try to, stop this guy from doing something. And so there starts this pattern of appeasement to satisfy demands in order to maintain peace or avoid war. So think of that. Look at that root word there, appease. If you are trying to appease somebody, it's kind of like when your mom tells you to clean your room, and rather than fighting, you just say, okay, yeah, I'm going to do it. Yeah, maybe you do or you don't. But you give in just because you don't want to have a fight about it. So this is the pattern of appeasement. Hitler allies himself with Mussolini. You can see in that picture right here, Hitler is on the right, Mussolini is on the left. They look like they're very enjoying their time together, very gregarious. People in the background are happy to see this parade coming by. These are two fascist dictators. Hitler is very supportive of Mussolini when he invades Ethiopia in Africa, and that's not allowed. Remember, Ethiopia had been a independent country. They were never imperialized by anybody, and Mussolini thinks he can get his hands on Ethiopia. And so they signed the Rome-Berlin Axis, which is basically an alliance. Again, one of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles is you cannot make alliances. Well, here's another example of Hitler violating it. The Anschluss. The Anschluss was this union with Austria. Hitler forced the Austrian chancellor to annex with the Nazis in charge of the government. Now, part of the issue was the Austrian chancellor, the Austrian government just kind of laid down and said, okay, Hitler, you can do whatever you want. They did not necessarily like to start a kind of government with Germany under Hitler. However, Hitler really wanted Austria because Hitler was from Austria. And so he kind of had this sense of entitlement, like, well, I was born and raised in Austria, therefore I deserve to have it under my control through Germany. And they kind of let him. He signs an anti-Comintern pact with Japan, and that was to work against communism, especially the Soviet Union. Think about where the Soviet Union is. It's huge. It's in Europe, but it's also in Asia. The far eastern edges of the Soviet Union are very near Japan. Well, Japan is rising in power themselves, and they have a fear of communism. So they sign, Hitler and Germany and Japan sign the Anti-Comintern Pact to stop Soviet aggression. Hitler annexes the Sudetenland. Now, the Sudetenland is in Czechoslovakia. I need to go back here for a second and mention this map again. So you remember when we just looked at this, and this map of the area in the pink that says Sudetenland? Czechoslovakia was a newly formed country after the Treaty of Versailles. The Sudetenland is primarily German people, but it's been given over to this new country called Czechoslovakia that was broken up and made into a country at this time. Hitler decides that because most of the people who live in the Sudetenland they speak German, they are of German heritage, they are not Czech, they have very little allegiance to this new nation, he decides that it's within his right to annex the Sudetenland, this area of mostly German people living in Western Czechoslovakia. When Hitler's doing all these things and violating all of these measures, they finally call a meeting. When I say they, it was the large members of the European countries. And they call this meeting in Germany. They decide to hold it, called the Munich Conference. Now, part of the issue is these leaders from Europe call this meeting and they decide to have it in Hitler's hometown. Hitler lives in Munich. So what makes me wonder is not only are you calling this meeting to say, hey, you got to stop this, but then why would you it's a little bit like they're giving in to him one more time. And they call this meeting in Europe, and all the big leaders come, and they gave in to all of Hitler's demands. They said, you can't annex the Sudetenland. He made a very persuasive argument why they should, and he lets them. The Czechoslovakia is left kind of out on their own. Nobody supports them. Nobody comes to their aid. Nobody says, hey, you can't do that, when they're face to face with Hitler. You know, before they're saying you can't do that, you can't do these things, but when it comes down to it at this conference, and so look at that cartoon over there on the right. The baby with the bottle is Hitler. He's sucking on the bottle, which says the Munich Agreement. He's got a whole bag of added concessions, basically whatever he wants. One of the people over the adults, the one shushing, he'll be quiet now, maybe. That's Chamberlain. Chamberlain is the Prime Minister of Great Britain after David Lloyd George. And then behind Chamberlain is the rest of Europe kind of saying, oh my, do you think we should have done that? Should we have given in so easily just to shut him up? But that's what Europe did. So we're going to stop right there for the day. We will talk a little bit more about the USSR and Stalin, starting probably a short little bit on Thursday as well. So watch for an email from me concerning the project topic that you're going to be working on, and have a great Monday and Tuesday.